Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students. My name is Harald Badinger. I'm Vice Rector for Financial Affairs, and I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of WEU's Rectors Council to WEU's event series, WEU Matters, WEU Talks. The content of today's edition of WEU Matters, WEU Talks has been prepared and organized by the Department of Economics. This continues the WEU lecture series in economics, which dates back to 2011 and has a history of prominent speakers. For example, David Stern, Jacob de Haan, Stefan Zimmermann, and also today's discussant, as I hope so, Ewald Nowotny. I'm very happy to announce another prominent speaker for today. Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, will give a talk on the crisis of democratic capitalism. Mr. Wolf, welcome at WEU. It's a pleasure and honor having you here tonight. I would have liked to welcome the governor of our central bank. I think he's still caught in a traffic jam, but I hope he will arrive in a few minutes. But I would also like to welcome Professor Ingrid Cuban, head of the Department of Economics. Dear Ingrid, welcome and thank you and your department for organizing this event. The program for tonight is as follows. I will soon hand over to Ingrid for some introductory words. Then Martin Wolf will give his lecture, which is followed, hopefully, by a discussion by Ewald Nowotny. We will then have a discussion, first among the speakers and then also with the audience. Let me reflect a few seconds just on the title of today's talk, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. I think this is a very interesting title, and when I first read it, it triggered several associations. Are we here talking about the crisis of democracy? A failure of today's democratic institutions in addressing the big challenges? Or is it a crisis of capitalism, the market economy, which has gone beyond reasonable limits? Or maybe it is the failure of democratic institutions in taming capitalism that has led to undesirable economic outcomes, thereby threatening democracy. So it sounds a bit like a classical hen-egg problem. So in sum, this is a short title, many questions, many deep questions, but no matter which type of crisis it is clear to me that economics and economists can play a crucial role in solving or at least addressing this crisis and future challenges. And of course, I'm talking about economics as a science, not ideological economics in the disguise of science. Quite recently, Jean Tirole, Nobel Prize winner of 2014, published a book entitled Economics for the Common Good. He argues that economics is anything but a dismal science, and while it cannot offer simple solutions, he convincingly shows that it does offer a lot of insights and answers to today's big challenges, ranging from unemployment to climate change. So it is a highly interesting, a deep book written by a masterful economist, which, like only a few others, has accomplished to achieve an admirable balance between rigor and relevance. With its close to 600 pages, it is also a hard read, but if you're looking for an intellectually challenging Christmas present to someone interested in economics, this might be the right choice. Anyway, let's move on. I would like to welcome once more Professor Ingrid Cuban. And Ingrid, I would like to ask you to the stage for your introductory remarks.
So, does this work now? Okay, so welcome also from my side, a very warm welcome on this cold winter day. I'm glad you joined us here today. My name is Ingrid Cuban, and as already mentioned, I'm head of the Department of Economics at WEU. The WU Lectures in Economics is the outreach event of our department. It's very important for us, and it has already some tradition. We started these events in 2011, and ever since, Professor Jesus Crespo and the students of the VW-Zentrum organized this lecture series. We are proud that since last year, it is part of the prestigious WU Matters WU Talk series. It still continues to be the highlight of the outreach activities of our department. Outreach in two dimensions. It is an economic lecture with which we intend to address a broader audience beyond the core academic economics academia. I think with this year's speaker, we definitely succeeded in doing so. And it is a lecture at the same time in which we try to discuss burning topics at the forefront of our discipline. Past topics included the financial crisis and monetary policy, climate change, and last year, evidence-based economic policy making and the role of research institutes and academic research. I will not talk more on the Department of Economics, but you find our departmental report on a desk behind with much more highlights of our department. And I'm also proud to announce that we are on Twitter now. This year's topic of the lecture, the crisis of democratic capitalism. Martin Wolf suggested this topic among other possibilities. We immediately chose this one because of its thrilling relevance to the current political and economic issues. Let me briefly introduce Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf actually has Viennese roots. His father, Edmund Wolf, was a playwright and dramaturg, as he put it, at the Volkstheater in Vienna. He fled from Nazi Austria to London. Martin Wolf's mother suffered a similar fate. I'm glad that the Literaturhaus in Vienna commemorated the 100th birthday of Edmund Wolf some years ago. And I'm also very glad that Martin Wolf comes quite often to Vienna. Martin Wolf was born in 1946 in London and studied in Oxford, moving from classics to politics, philosophy, and economics, and finally to economics per se, the correct subject. After graduation, he joined the World Bank and worked on East Africa and India. He then worked at the Trade Policy Research Center that focused on multilateral trade policy. So he started his professional life as international trade economist. But in the late 1980s, he joined the Financial Times and became what he is known for ever since. Chief economist commentator, and associated editor of the Financial Times. Nowadays, he's one of the most influential economic commentators in the world. Martin Wolf is a brilliant communicator. He has the outstanding talent to build a bridge between academic and political discussions. He not only writes in Financial Times, this is perhaps what everybody here in the room knows. He also publishes important books that are well received in the academic world, but whose impact reaches far beyond the academic economists. One fine example is his most recent book on the macroeconomic consequences on the financial crisis, The Shifts and the Shocks, published in 2014. His numerous honorary degrees, and Martin Wolf mentioned that he will get the 6th honorary doctoral degree next year, and the academic affiliations bear testimony to his attachment to the academic world. I only mentioned the University of Nottingham, which is one of the leading UK research institutes in international economics. At this university, he's special professor, or he told me he's now honorary professor, And he was awarded, I think, his first honorary doctoral degree. And once a year, for now more than 30 years, he gives a public lecture. When I spent a sabbatical at Nottingham University in 2006, I attended this public lecture. It was on the global imbalances, with the end in tears. I remembered this lecture. I admit I looked it up now in the internet, but I had a vivid memory of this lecture, and I also remember that that I realized back then that he's not only a precise writer and analyst, but he was and is an excellent speaker. I was fascinated back then by his crystal clear account of complex international economic relations, and I'm really thrilled to have him here today in our public lecture series. Today's topic is the crisis of democratic capitalism. The evolution of the political system and the economic system. This is how I see the topic. Its co-evolution and its mutual influence is a long-standing topic, not only for Martin Wolf, but I guess also for Martin Wolf. I guess it actually is a true lifelong topic for him that started already at his time at the World Bank, working on development issues with their intricate and complex economic policy interrelations. It never lost its relevance, and it forcefully returned to the center states in Europe with the rise of populism and the increase in economic, but not only economic inequality. I'm looking forward, I'm doing very much so, to your presentation now. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, now I've got to do something really important, which is to get the text part of what I have to say up. So it's a great pleasure to be here. As is already mentioned, I have a very significant family connection with this city. My father lived here, to be precise, for 23 years, from the age of 4 in 1914 to the age of 27 in 1937, when he thought that it might be better to go somewhere else. This was a very shrewd decision. And indeed, as has already been mentioned, he met my mother, who was from Holland, in London, and the rest, as they say, is history. At least it's my history. So in a different world, there might well have been a Martin Wolf who would have spoken flawless Austrian German and would have had an entirely different life story, but I think I prefer mine. There are some advantages to have been, in this age of the world, to have been brought up in an English-speaking country, or as I like to say, the English-speaking country. Now, why am I talking about the crisis of democratic capitalism? Well, I think if you understand where my father came from, and the fact that he spent much of the post-war years as a journalist, particularly writing for all the major German newspapers, Die Zeit, the Süddeutsche in particular, it's pretty clear why. Because the thing that I learned, and as you will have now realized, I'm in my 70s, the thing that I've learnt from him and that I have learnt since in my life, and we are experiencing now, is that the success of the economic system is intimately bound up with the stability of our political system. So that would be my answer to the question, what is this about? And since the economic system has not been working very well, I think that's pretty obvious in many cases, and other profound changes have been going on, I think there is a lot of evidence that our political system, democracy, and I'm referring specifically to the Western political system, this is what this lecture is about, has lost a great deal of legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And it is pretty obvious that this is the case if you look at recent political developments, and if I may suggest so, even here in Austria. So the issue is clear. What I'm trying to understand, and this is part of a very early stage of a book I'm writing, another book I'm writing on this title, is the co-evolution of our economic and political systems in the Western world, where we are and where we might be going. So I hope that that's the title of the lecture. Let me just start with two thought-provoking quotations from two very interesting thinkers. Probably the book that I have read this year that has influenced me most is by a German ancient historian. I'm back to my starting point. As has already been mentioned, I spent a very large amount of my life as a classicist, and this subject, democracy and capitalism, has brought me back very much to that. So Walter Scheidel has written a book called The Great Leveler, which is about inequality and inequality over the last 10,000 years. So I think it is an extraordinary work of scholarship based on an immense amount of research that has been done in the last 3 decades on this topic. But one of the issues that I am addressing is how far, which is actually the subject of my column tomorrow, how far it is possible to sustain democracy when enormous inequality emerges, absolutely enormous inequality emerges. And this, by the way, as I'm sure you all know, and if you don't, you should, was a question that very much concerned Aristotle, right at the beginning of thinking about political systems. And so it's not a new question, and it's a very relevant one. And Scheidel's points are essentially pessimistic. What he says is that history teaches us, says many things, but this is the quote that I want to give you, teaches us 2 important things about leveling. One is that radical policy interventions occur in times of crisis. So in terms of times of crisis, we can do things which we would otherwise think are unthinkable. And we are, I think, in times of crisis, and therefore maybe we can. But the second lesson is even more straightforward, that policy making, if you like, the Jean Tirole approach to life, can take us only so far. Beyond a certain point, we are in the realm of politics and power. We are not in the realm of platonic guardians, which is what economists think they are. The second quote is from somebody completely different, again relevant to where we are. I'm leaving these quotes for you to think about. Some of the implications will become obvious as I proceed. And this is a very famous quote for people in international economics interested in this subject, because it reflects Dani Rodrik's, Dani Rodrik, by the way, is a professor at Harvard and one of the world's most influential thinkers on the political economy of globalization. And he wrote that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any 2 of the 3, but never have all 3 simultaneously and in full. And what he meant by that, Scheidel is telling us that policy doesn't get us very far. There's a limit on what you can do with policy, because politics don't allow you to do what you'd like to do. And what Dani says, in a way, is you can think of it almost as a corollary of it, is that if we have truly global capitalism, we can't have democracy, because essentially the realm over which democratic decision-making can operate becomes vanishingly small. And if the capitalist system works extremely badly, that creates very tormented and tormenting politics. So those are just my introduction to this subject. What I want to talk about, I'm going to try and get through this in the next 35 minutes, keep to time, I try to, is first the relationship between democracy and global capitalism. And then I'm going to talk about the key subject, which is what I think of as a pervasive erosion of trust between the people at large, or very significant parts of the body politic in Western countries. And just to make it simple, I'm going to say it right now, I'm going to focus on the big Western countries, the G7, or more precisely the G6, because I'm not going to include Japan because it's sui generis. In most cases, it's so special. So basically, the Western Europeans and the United States, and to some degree, Canada. So it's not going to be about Austria, sorry. But you can draw any conclusions you want from what I'm going to talk about. So the erosion of trust, which I think is related, among other things, and I'll try and discuss that, to economic failures, pervasive and profound economic failures, in the eyes of large parts of the body politic. And because of the erosion of trust, and this is the last thing I go to, where we go now, what has emerged is policy entrepreneurs, often called populists, predominantly of the right, though to a small degree of the left, who have exploited that erosion of trust for their own political ends. And there is nothing new about this. It is exactly what happened here and in other countries in the interwar years. And the results can be, as we surely know from that experience, totally catastrophic. So the erosion of trust issue is a central one, and I'm not going to talk about how we can solve that erosion of trust, because I don't have enough time, and you'll have to read the book. But I think I can do, what I can do in the very limited time is discuss how we got here and what the problem is. That's what I would like to do today. So let me start by talking about democracy and global capitalism. So in our, and I want to stress that when I talk about global capitalism, I'm talking about this in a sort of lowercase sense. I'm not trying to put forward some completely free market, completely, as we used to think of it, Austrian school version of global capitalism. I'm just simply talking about the sort of economic system we have had for most of the post-war period, but particularly for the last 40 years or so in the West. That is to say, a system which is internationally fairly liberal, free trade at least, or very liberal trade, fairly free movement of capital. We can discuss how far. Obviously, very free movement of ideas, driven by technology and driven also by policies. I don't have the time to go further into all that. That's presented in my book on globalization. But that's the sort of economic system I have in mind. Essentially a market economy, which is not limited to individual nations, but is, in an important sense, global. And that's our economic system, broadly defined. There are many variants on it, but I think that is, broadly speaking, the economic system we become used to. And at the same time, we have a political system in the West, and actually, as I will show you, in much of the world, which is universal suffrage democracy, by which I simply mean a system of electoral competition between parties or between individuals in the case of presidential systems, which is ritualized, law-governed, and reasonably orderly. A system in which the competition is endless and no one ultimately wins. Now, is this relationship, so let's start from the beginning, between our political systems and our economic systems in any way a natural one? When you think about it, it's not obvious that it is. And I think there are reasons for believing it is, and there are reasons for believing it isn't. And my conclusion is that the former are sufficiently important to believe that it's rather difficult to imagine democracy without some sort of market economic system. But it is clearly a very difficult marriage It's a very difficult relationship, not a simple one. Now, if we look at it historically, and I'm going to show you the rise of capitalism in its modern form over the last 2 centuries, was in fact associated with a rapid rise in the significance of democratic political institutions, and of course the elimination of serfdom and ultimately also of slavery, and of course also associated with massive expansions of the suffrage. These are the first universal suffrage societies in the history of the world. There have been no true universal suffrage societies until modern times. And I would argue that one of the reasons for this relationship, perhaps the most important, it was a series of economic changes, urbanization, the increasingly wide sharing of prosperity, the spread of education, incredibly important, the emergence of organized labor as a part of the industrialization process, and not least, something Scheidel stresses, the mobilization of populations in the 19th century for war. And in addition to all those factors, at a most basic level, the increase in prosperity has allowed politics to have a certain positive sum character. It's easier to make consensual politics work if you've got more money to share every year, or at least most years. And finally, I think there is a certain ideological harmony, as well as much tension, which I'll come to, between democracy and capitalism, because both share one very important feature, which is the simple view that choices made by individuals have inherent value, be they in the political system or be they in the economic systems. So that, again, you can sort of see a rationality behind the association of these two apparently very different systems. But at the same time, it is also obvious that there are pretty profound tensions between these two conjoined symbiotic systems of our world. Democracy, of course, at least at the most basic ideological level, is an egalitarian ideal, one person, one vote. Capitalism does not rest on any such egalitarian ideal other than the principle that anybody is entitled to engage in the market. Democracy is, of course, as the great Albert Hirschman pointed out, the domain of voice. It's the domain of collective action. Capitalism is the domain of exit. It's where individual decision-making is dominant. And much more relevant and topical, as I've already pointed out, this discussion goes back to the ancient Greeks. Very high inequality, which can emerge from a competitive market economy, and the capitalist system in its present form clearly is generating that, risks turning democracy in an increasingly plutocratic direction. And again, if the global economy fails, ceases to provide people with the prosperity they expect, there's a profound danger that people will turn to illiberal political structures and leaders who promise simple solutions by eliminating the democratic competitive process. So at a pretty fundamental level, you can see a whole series of tensions between democracy and the market economy. And there's one final one, which I think is particularly relevant to today's world, which is the erosion of what I call citizenship rent. So if you think of our current world, the main characteristic, and I don't have the time to go into this in detail, but a dominant characteristic of our current world is that economies, countries across the world, are radically different in their wealth, just enormously different in their wealth. So it's probably true today, and it's been true for about 150 years, but it's particularly true now, that the single most important determinant of whether or not you will personally lead a prosperous life is simply where you were born, which country you're born in. If you're born in Austria, you are likely to lead a very much more profitable, prosperous life than if you're born in Mali, purely the accident of birth. And by virtue of being born in a rich country, you expect to share in the goods of that country. Now, one of the things that the global market economy and its closely associated feature, I'll come to this later, which is large-scale migration, brings about, is it some degree of erosion, or at least the perception of some degree of erosion of the value that one obtains simply from being born in a certain country. And Richard Baldwin's recent book, The Great Convergence, explains this beautifully in the case of trade, because what he says there is that in the modern world, where businesses can produce anywhere, and therefore products can be produced in principle anywhere, supply chains can be unbundled, knowledge can be moved across the globe, workers in the Western world suddenly find themselves in direct competition with workers all across the world, including in countries, and particularly in countries where wages are much lower because the country on average is much less prosperous. This erodes their citizenship rent. It's perfectly rational for them to feel it's eroding their citizenship rent, and migration does the same. So those are that's the final and I think biggest issue, one of the biggest issues we now confront. Now, with that as the conceptual underpinning of what I have to say, let me just give you some history of what's happened in the past on the relationship, on the history of democracy, before I start discussing its relationship with one measure of global capitalism. So this chart shows quite simply, it comes from the Polity 4 dataset, which is one of the best datasets available of electoral democracy as a system. It's not very rich beyond the simple idea of measuring, is there competitive electoral processes? And the interesting thing about this, if you take the red line, which is the line of democracies, you can see that the last 2 centuries have seen an enormous rise in the number of democracies, universal, at least wide suffrage democracies. Back in 1800, there were, on their measure, 0. By 1920, there were about 25. It collapsed, of course, in the 30s into the Second World War. Then there was a rise after the war, a slow rise in the 50s and 60s, and then an explosion after 1989. And now, in the most recent figures, there are close to 100 democracies. So you could see very clearly the world has become, over this period, more democratic. Now, as you probably all know, the number of countries in the world has also exploded, particularly since 1945, because of decolonization. So those last figures included an enormous expansion in the number of countries. So this chart simply shows the proportion of the world's countries that are democracies. That's the blue area. And you can see there was a progressive rise up to 1920, a collapse in the interwar years, and when mass decolonization occurred, many became autocratic. And then again, in the last 25, 30 years, we've had an enormous increase in democracies. And today, on their database, close to half of the world's countries are democracies. Another, I don't know, 30% are what they call anocracies, which are basically chaotic regimes, and only a relatively small proportion are true autocracy. So this is a pretty massive shift, and in a sense, for those of us who believe in democracy, rather encouraging. And the final thing I wanted to show, because it brings us directly to my discussion of the topic of the evening, is the link that that might have with one measure of global capitalism, or the globalization of capitalism. And for this, what I've done is show the line of the proportion of countries that are democratic, which you can read on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, I've shown as a measure of the health of global capitalism, just a simple indicator, the ratio of world trade to world GDP, which is the blue line and then the orangey line. And there are two successive series which are joined rather precisely, so I'm reasonably comfortable with these figures. This is trade in real terms, by the way. That has quite significant. Trade in nominal terms is very distorting because the prices of tradable goods have collapsed over the decades. Now, the big point is, which actually I was genuinely surprised with when I did it, is that there's a fairly close correlation between these two series, the democracy series and the globalization series. So in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there was a progressive rise in trade relative to world GDP and a progressive rise in the number of democratic regimes. The interwar years saw a collapse in trade and a collapse in the number of democracies. The post-war period saw a revival and then stabilization. Then this explosive growth of globalization, which we can see in the last 40 years, was closely associated with the explosive growth of democracy. And I suggest that this is actually not, I think, false correlation. I think there is something profound going on there. Periods of economic dynamism, the two great periods were the late 19th and early 20th century and the post-war period, are periods of burgeoning trade. Trade tends to grow faster than GDP in periods of economic dynamism. They're periods when people feel more optimistic, there's greater prosperity, and the market system seems more credible. And when the trade system collapses, partly because of depressions, partly because of protectionism, this goes along with a turn away from the optimistic view of politics expressed in democracy. So I think there is a reason why there is this relationship, and I feel reasonably comfortable about it. Nevertheless, the question obviously arises, where are we now? In terms of this chart, what we can see is that both globalization and democratization have halted, and that looks roughly right. But some of the more recent evidence is much more disturbing than that. According to Freedom House, a total of 67 countries suffered net declines in political rights and civil liberties in 2016, compared with only 36 that generated gains. This was the 11th consecutive year in which declines outnumbered improvements. In 2016, it was established democracies, the countries of the West, that dominated the list of countries suffering setbacks in democracy. And according to a very now well-known study by Roberto Fo and Yasha Monk, and I quote, over the last 3 decades, trust in political institutions such as parliaments or the courts has precipitously declined across the established democracies of North America and Western Europe. So, in conclusion, the Freedom House, and a number of other studies and analysts have concluded we are now once again in a democratic recession, a decline of the legitimacy of democracy across the world. It's pretty obvious that that's the case. We are also in a period of strong deglobalization pressure, and therefore the concern that animates this lecture about the relationship between the two and what is happening to each of them is, I think, a completely justified one. So let me now turn to the erosion of trust, the second major issue. And I'll try and go through this relatively quickly. I want to make just one preliminary point. I'm going to focus on economic failure because I'm an economist, and I think economic failures have been very important in explaining the erosion of trust. There are a whole host of studies purporting to show that the erosion of trust is predominantly cultural. It's to do with cultural change. And I only want to make one important preliminary point, which is I don't think we can separate these two things. I think they are intimately connected. So if you think about deindustrialization, that is an economic process. I'm going to show it to you. But it has very profound social and cultural consequences because of the people who are affected by it. Similarly, immigration is clearly an economic phenomenon, but it clearly also creates cultural and social challenges. Separating out cultural from economic change in societies like ours is, in my view, virtually impossible to do. And so I feel quite happy with focusing on the economic changes, which I think also have had very significant cultural and social impacts. So let me just look at a few of the things that have happened. And what I'm trying to do in this is to identify places where changes have been particularly large and ask ourselves whether they might be associated with particularly significant rises in populist phenomena and populist pressures. And I hope I will persuade you that there is such a connection, and it is quite a significant one. Now, the first thing, which is obviously very important, these data unfortunately only go to 2013, so the data for Germany are no longer very representative of what has happened. But it is clear that there have been very significant rises, or pretty significant rises, in the proportion of foreign-born in the populations of quite a large number of major economies. Interestingly, the US, despite recent rhetoric, is not among them. The countries that are most affected by big increases have been Sweden, the UK, Italy, and Spain. To me, the real anomaly among those countries, and it's a very interesting anomaly, is Spain, because Spain is the only one of these countries in which immigration has not emerged as a dominant political issue. Immigration was, in my view, the reason why the UK voted for Brexit. Immigration dominates a lot of the populist politics of Italy, and it's become a very significant issue in Sweden. The second issue, which I wanted to emphasize, brings us very close to Dani Rodrik's thoughts, and it links up with what I said about Richard Baldwin, which is the impact of globalization, and particularly the competition across the value chain that is created by the possibility of unbundling value chains across the world. The awareness that almost any activity in our productive systems can be delocalized. This chart, which I've taken from the OECD, again looking at quite a number of major countries, shows in 1995 and 2011 the extent of global value chains, or the increase of global value chains, which is foreign value-added share of gross exports, namely the proportion of the value of exports which is itself imported. And you can see that across almost the entire developed world, not so significantly interested in the US nor in Canada, but dramatically across Europe and even in Japan, the rise of global value chains has been very, very significant. And this means, of course, that the tradable goods production of our world is subject to competition in a way that, as Dani Rodrik would say, simply wasn't true 30 or 40 years ago, and this has very important implications for a lot of workers. This also links to a third huge background change, a systemic background change in our economies, and that is deindustrialization, the simple disappearance of the industrialized labor force, predominantly male, as the major employer, or close to the major employer, particularly of relatively unskilled, semi-skilled, moderately skilled, somewhat less skilled men. And this I show for US and Germany. These are two very important developed countries. Germany has a much larger labor force share in manufacturing than the US because it has its huge export surplus. But you can see in both cases the slopes are the same. And the US figures are pretty representative now of most other industrialized countries. The industrialized mass labor forces of 40 years ago have simply disappeared. The protest by people like that, people affected by the disappearance of industrial jobs, was a dominant factor in the electorates of Donald Trump and the vote for Brexit. It is a massive background factor in explaining the discontent of a very large number of people, predominantly male, in Western society. Sorry, how did I do that? Ah, good. The next change I want to focus on is inequality. Again, these are background conditions. I'm going to come to the more recent changes, which these background conditions that eroded people's confidence in the justice of the system. Now, this just looks at income inequality in 2010. It's the latest figures for which we have this. The really interesting point I wanted to bring out here is the enormous difference in the effectiveness of welfare states in offsetting high inequality in terms of making a difference between the market income inequality and disposable income inequality. On this data set, surprisingly I have to say, but the Gini coefficient is a slightly strange measure, the US is not exceptionally unequal in market income, but it has substantially the greatest inequality in disposable income of these countries. And the reason simply is that policy is much, much less effective in attenuating this. And that, of course, is about to get worse in the US as a result of the tax bill that is now going through. Interestingly, the UK, which seems on a household income basis to be even more unequal than the US in this data set, has a far more effective redistribution system, attenuating the inequality of disposable income quite substantially. The US is clearly the outlier here in terms of what it does through the state to offset inequality. More important, however, is, I think, what has happened to the income shares of the top 10%. The top 1% will be a very significant factor over the last 30 or 40 years. And the dramatic divergence in this regard between the Anglophone countries, the US and UK, and the others. So if you go back to 1913, you'll see these data are incomplete. They're bound to be incomplete. Come from the Wealth and Income Database. What they show you is that we had remarkably equal societies by historical standards in the middle of the century. That remained the case up till the 1980s, and since then we've seen, with the turn in policy towards much more free market policy in the US and UK, that they have had very large increases in equality. This has also happened, interestingly, in Japan, but much, much less true in France and Germany, with a middling experience. So we have seen a reversal in the US case in particular to the sort of top income shares that they had back before the Great Depression. It's a sort of massive U-turn in the United States. Again, I think it is a very important background factor in explaining the nature of American politics today. Unemployment is also a significant issue, and here we're getting to the impact of the crisis. In unemployment, the UK, US, and Germany have done very, very well. It's not a fundamental issue. Here it is Italy and France that are the most adversely affected. But I think more significant than unemployment is what you see here, and where Italy and the US are exceptional. So what this shows is the proportion of people in the ages of 25 to 54 who are actually in work or looking for it. And the remarkable thing in this is that the US participation rate for prime-aged adults has completely collapsed. There are an immense number of people. Unemployment is low, as I've shown you, but the crucial thing about what's happened in the US, in my view, is that so many people have simply given up looking for work. They've abandoned the labor force because the changes in the economy have deprived them of work and the hope of work. There's a whole litany of explanations which I can't go into detail. And again, it seems to me very clear that fact has been a dominant one in explaining recent politics in the US. Into all this, given all this background story that I've been telling you, there then came along because most of what I've been telling you is a background event of increasing unhappiness in many of our countries, some more than others. Then came the immense shock of the financial crisis. And here I've shown for a whole large number, basically the same major countries, the scale of the decline of GDP per head that occurred during the crisis. Then we had the second crisis in the Eurozone, which had a particularly dramatic effect on Spain and Italy. You can see the declines have been very, very dramatic, though Spain is now recovering strongly. Germany has done remarkably well, so relatively unaffected by this. But it is important to stress that the cumulative increases in GDP per head, with exception of Germany, and even then this is only true to a modest degree, but in all the other major developed countries over the last decade, are incomparably the lowest since the Second World War. I mean, basically GDP per head has been close to stagnant across the developed world. So they had all these background economic changes I've described, and then the pulverizing shock of a huge recession followed by a very, very weak recovery. And the impact of that is shown, I think, very beautifully in this data, which show that proportion of households with flat or falling real incomes from wages and capital between 2005-14. The data have not been updated since, but they haven't changed that much. What this shows you is that between 2/3 and close to 100% of the population, in the case of Italy, have had flat or falling real incomes over that decade period, which is essentially the most recent one. Sweden is a great exception, but they have a weighted average of 25 countries which have experienced close to stagnant real incomes. And the very last economic factor I want to show, because it brings out, I think, very clearly again the problems of the US and UK, is the fiscal austerity, the extent to which countries have been forced in the consequence of the crisis to have massive structural fiscal tightening. That structural fiscal tightening is shown by the purple columns, and you can see that in the UK and the US they were bigger than anywhere else. France follows. And the reason simply is that the financial crisis had such a devastating effect on the revenue generated in these countries. So what I've done here is to put together these various changes, and I've put each country, these countries that I've shown you, the G7, into one of three categories, either very badly affected, modestly affected, or little affected. One is little affected, two is moderately affected, three is badly affected. And if you sum these up, the countries with the highest numbers are the countries that are most affected by this series of shocks, economic shocks, long-term and immediate, that I've discussed. And the conclusion I reached is that the three most adversely affected major countries are Italy, the UK, and US. And therefore, my conclusion is that what we've seen in the politics of the UK and US, and are now seeing in the politics of Italy with the rise of Cinque Stelle and the Lega del Nord, is consistent with these economic factors. So let me just bring this together. What I'm arguing is fairly simple. Democracy and capitalism are a complex and very difficult but necessary and ultimately mutually supportive relationship. They need each other, but they also stress each other. If the economic system fails to deliver what the majority, or at least a very large proportion of the population, considers reasonable outcomes, the political system will react. The political system will react by concluding that conventional democratic politics don't work. And if the loss of trust is sufficiently big, and in many cases I think it is sufficiently big, people will emerge who will argue the elites who ran the economic, financial, bureaucratic, and political systems are corrupt. They have ignored the interests of the majority. They are delegitimized. And therefore, what we need is a new set of politicians who truly represent the interests and views of the people. And many such politicians, not all of them, will have an authoritarian streak and will reject democracy because democracy is a system which legitimizes precisely the people who, as they are arguing, have imposed these unnecessary and terrible shocks economic shocks on people. And this process of populist politicians emerging to challenge the legitimacy not only of other politicians but of the system itself has now become a very substantial feature of politics in some very, very important countries. So how might this end? What is the potential end of this? Well, one possibility and I think we can see the possibility in some countries, we're not there yet, is the collapse of democracy into plutocracy or outright authoritarianism. I call the plutocratic element of this Pluto-populism, and it has basically become the politics of the Republican Party in the United States. The second possibility is that we are going to have a return to genuinely closed economic systems. And that is pretty clearly what Mr. Corbyn represents in Britain. That's the ideology he represents. I'm not saying he'll get into power or that he'll implement it, but what he really wants to do is close the economy down, particularly the capital flow side. We could have a combination of the two, as happened in before the Second World War. If we elect authoritarian populists like Mr. Trump, we have a serious risk of war. Anyone who's paying attention should realize that. I suggest you study the National Security Strategy that has just come out yesterday. So these are a number of really pretty bad possible outcomes of where we are. There are, of course, alternatives. And the alternative we should all want is a return to a cooperative system that delivers both global order, because we fundamentally depend on global cooperation to manage our economy, the global environment, and everything else, while simultaneously satisfying the interests and concerns of very, very unhappy people in our countries. To do that, I think, we actually have to be prepared to consider much deeper cooperation among our economies on things like taxation and regulation. A form of democratic politics which actually involves extending a lot of what democratic polities do to a global level. And if we succeed in that, we might actually manage a cooperation across all jurisdictions, including, of course, and I haven't even been able to mention that in detail today, our relationships with emerging countries, above all China. What I want to leave you with is simply this. Our system, like all very complex systems, and ours is a very complex political and economic system, is fragile. If people lose trust in our system, its fragility becomes a really serious issue. There are major countries, as I've tried to indicate here, that have made a sufficiently large mess of their economic arrangements over the long term and in the short term, in the context of huge and profound changes, that their politics have become deeply dysfunctional. We cannot assume this will come right automatically. The great challenge, in my view, of our time is to work hard to make it come right. Thank you very much for listening.
Dear Mr. Moles, thank you very much for this interesting talk and also your outlook, which gives reason both for fear but also for hope. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and before I'm looking forward to the comment by Professor Novotny, Governor of the Austrian Central Bank. I'm very happy that you made it to us after all, so welcome, and please come to the stage to give your comment.
Good to see you.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you very much. And first I have to excuse myself for being late. I'm very glad to be with Martin Wolf again. So we have had many chances for discussion. I also want to stress that my comments are, of course, my personal comments, and not those of a central banker. I'd like to start with what you have showed, this famous trilemma of Dani Rodrik. And for me, I think the way how to approach this kind of dilemma is to look at it in a bit more differentiated way. So it's about democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration. I would see the democracy part exactly as you see. With regard to national sovereignty, I would see that we do have an evolution into something like supranational sovereignty. And of course, you are both an observer and, I may say, a victim of the discussion you have in the UK. That's what I think, for me, therefore, the role of European integration and the EU as a supranational institution is something very different from this small concept of national sovereignty, because it has a much bigger bargaining power. And the third point of global economic integration, I would say also here you can have a certain differentiation in the way that I would see this as controlled economic integration. And if you have this combination of controlled economic integration and supranational sovereignty, then I think what you see is, yes, we will not have this all-encompassing worldwide cooperation that you have advocated, which clearly is the first best solution, but perhaps not easy to reach. But I think there is kind of a practical form in the way that you have larger regional groups, supranational groups, that are strong enough, powerful enough to defend specific economic perspectives, economic systems. And the economic system I want to be defended and also expanded in Europe is what we have come to call the European model, which historically is something like not this concept of democratic capitalism, but what we call social market economy or social ecological market economy. That means that you have a market economy, but with active policy intervention. And it's clear that to have this active policy intervention, you have to have a certain control of your borders, both with regard to trade, and therefore I think that we will see an end to the idea of just pure and simple trade liberalization, where every social aspect can be seen as a non-tariff trade barrier. So I think we will have to have negotiated trade deals, and also it means that one has to have control of one's borders. And so it's quite clear that a fully open labor market is not consistent with a system of a more elevated social policy. But if you see this in a bigger scale, at the European level, then I think this would be exactly a way to go forward in these dilemmas that I think you very clearly demonstrated. Being here at my old university, I also think that from the, let's say, theoretical foundations of this means very clearly that the traditional concept, old concept of Austrian economics, this very ultra-liberal one, cannot help us in this to solve these problems. But that we would have to have some kind of more, let's say, for many parts of the economy, Keynesian-oriented, institutional-oriented, policy-oriented approaches, as we have had it in many countries for quite a long time, and as we still have this compared to the US. So just to finish with this, I think the model that seems to be both the better one and also the practical achievable one is, let's say, the model of a European economic and social model, and not the American. So I think we do have a perspective, and I think there's, or at least it's the challenge, not to live in a world that is totally formed according to the US economic model. And this then is, of course, what we will see, therefore, is a kind of regionalization. It is, I think, the idea that we have a totally uninhibited world trade is a dangerous idea. And the growth perspective, and the idea that this will be very growth enhancing is only if you look at a very small and rather strange definition of economic growth. If you have a more encompassing definition of economic growth, then I think this kind of, let's say, enlightened regionalism is something that hopefully could solve some of the problems that you have shown. This is perhaps some of the point I wanted to make, but otherwise I think we are all eager for the discussion with you, so we'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'm looking at the time, so I will just ask very few questions to you to start the discussion, to trigger the discussion, and then turn to a discussion with the audience. Mr. Wolf, just one point, because we just heard again the Rodrik quote, and I like part of the stuff Rodrik has written, but I think this quote is not very fortunate because it also almost looks a bit like academic populism. Democracy is no 0-1 decision. National sovereignty is not a 0-1 decision, and globalization is also not a 0-1 decision. So in my view, there is a broad range of values in between these extremes, which can, of course, be reconciled with each other by an intelligent policy approach. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, I would agree, but the point, the reason why this, I think, is an interesting way of framing it, and Ewald Novotny has actually picked it up, I think, in an interesting way, is that in quite a number of cases, important cases, the balance between these that was struck in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades has not ended well. So, as I said, my aim in this lecture was to describe what I think, at least some of the problems we confront, and not discuss how we're going to solve them, though we've now moved in that direction. But I think it is fair to say now that the balance struck in global policy and domestic politics in the US, UK, and in a completely different way, Italy. So I'll just take those 3 countries. Doesn't look now, to put it mildly, as having worked very well. And now that's pretty important because some of these countries are pretty important, and I would say that at the moment the US is still the most important single country in the world. And the results could be very, very destructive. I would say that you can't be as complacent as all that either about what's going on in the politics of some continental European countries where, and they vary, everybody has different problems. The problems of particularly of the populist right are hardly absent. And they're, of course, associated to a large degree with the migration challenge. So I would say, which is, I think, a fundamental aspect of the world in which we live, and is not going to be so easy to turn off. So, which is why it's the very first thing I mentioned. So I would say you're absolutely right. In theory, we can perfectly well imagine choosing a set of alternatives which would optimize, which would minimize, let's say, the problems we face. But as a matter of fact, we haven't. And as a matter of fact, a lot of countries, including some extraordinarily important ones, are in quite a mess as a result. And that's, I think, something we have to understand.
Thank you. So talking about solutions, Mr. Novotny, let me ask you one provocative question. Mr. Wolf has outlined the relationship between economic dynamism, well-being, and the increase in democracy which took place at the same time. And of course, then this should also hold into the other direction. Now we have this move to more authoritarian systems. Does this mean that we should wish Mr. Trump economic success, such that this will maybe then tip the balance again more towards democratic parties? Because if this trend really holds true, the other scenario would be a true disaster.
This is a tricky question. If I look at this from an egotistical point of view, of course I would wish him good success, because if the US is flourishing, Europe would profit. The US are like kind of the consumer of last resort. Our export surpluses would even grow. They would pay with the currency that everybody accepts. So in that sense, let's say in this trivial sense, I would see no problem. In a much, let's say, more political sense, in fact, I would see a lot of problems, because this policy of, let's say, increasing tensions, and it will increase the internal tensions. And we know from, and Martin Wolf knows this much better than I do, from history, you see that if there are internal tensions, one traditional way is to find foreign enemies, to get to some kind of warlike elements. So the political tensions would increase, and that, of course, on the other hand, is something that might do an immense harm to the world. So if I would look this as at a short term, purely short-sighted perspective, yes, I would say if the US is doing well, why not? But if it is doing well at the cost of an extremely unfair, divided country, then I would see that long-term risks are much higher.
There's another issue with this, which is, it was thinking about regionalism. You can think of America first is intrinsically a form of regionalism, because the US is a region. I mean, the US as a whole is as big as the EU, roughly, so it is a region in economic terms. It's about a quarter of the world economy, depending on how you measure it. Well, Mr. Trump might succeed politically. He might even succeed to some degree economically by pursuing a protectionist course, for example. And one might say, well, in the process, he's managing trade. But he can, in the process, simply disintegrate cooperative institutions which exist and which play quite an important role in managing, for instance, trade among world economic powers, including, in this case, China. So his success could be really quite destructive to quite important cooperative institutions. And this, where I was thinking when, in response to what Evan Watney said, it's interesting remarks, there can be relatively benign and relatively malign forms of regionalism. And it's not terribly difficult to imagine, in fact one can see it now, relatively malign forms of regionalism emerging, which essentially are built around the idea that the world is a zero-sum game, and that its aim is to benefit at the expense of everybody else. If the world's greatest power pursues that as its principal policy, and that's what Mr. Trump seems to be suggesting, it's rather difficult to see how the world as a whole will do well.
I see, yeah. Thank you. So I've noted at least 10 more questions, but I would like to proceed to the discussion with the audience. I would just ask you for two things. First, please introduce yourself before you ask your question. And second, please don't give another keynote lecture. Give a very concise statement and then please ask a question, because otherwise it will not be possible to get at least a large range of questions. Yeah, Mr. here.
So, thank you, sir. I can go and without, but thank you. First, thank you, Martin. I am Marin. Moving to the question. The crisis is in absolute poverty, or it is pretty much in relative poverty, and how we felt? The first question, and I'll give you a second one which you can not answer.
Sorry?
And I will give you a second question which you cannot answer if I'm being cheeky, asking the second question. Is it the crisis of democratic capitalism or simply a crisis? Because if we have an authoritarian state and people starving, people would love democracy. So isn't it just too narrow to say it's the crisis of democratic capitalism? This was the second one. The first one was about absolute or relative poverty. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer the questions as they go along or take several together?
It's probably better to get several together. The other one, I would like to have a lady, a woman. Let's switch from side to side, so please.
Ah.
No? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Patricia Freire. I have on one of your slides you mentioned that unlike Sweden, UK, and Italy, in Spain, the political discourse was not affected by immigration. And I wanted to ask you why you think this happened. If it had to do with the fact that the country was already in a crisis and it didn't coincide with immigration, or if it had to do with the nationalities of immigrants or something else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as I see it, these are two questions to you, I guess. A question to Mr. Novotny? Yes? Yes? Please? And then we make one answer round.
Hello. It's actually a question to both. What do you think is the role of central banks, both in creating the crisis, if at all, and what could be the role in solving it?
Okay, it's clearly a question to you. But let's start with you. I have the absolute versus relative poverty stuff, not just a normal crisis, rather than a crisis of democracy. And I think you've noted the last question. So please.
Well, it depends, I suppose, on how you... sorry, questions in order. Absolute poverty as historic... This brings me back to the starting point of my professional life. So absolute poverty, I think, was an idea, certainly in my sense, introduced as a core idea of the World Banks under Robert McNamara. And it was associated with a $1 a day purchasing power parity. So essentially, the idea is about being on the margin of subsistence, survival. And it is absolutely clear that, and I've just written about that in my column for tomorrow, the developed world doesn't suffer. There are no statistics which show any significant proportion of developed countries suffering from absolute poverty as that defined. In fact, the proportion of the world's population in absolute poverty defined on that basis has declined very rapidly in the last half century for reasons we all know. On that definition. So it's a problem of relative poverty. Relative poverty is simply just another way of talking about inequality. It's the same thing, obviously. It's just referring to inequality in terms of particular parts of the income distribution. And you can measure inequality, of course, in so many ways. However, I would argue that, and this perhaps links with your second question, which I do think is answerable, but maybe I'm wrong. Is it a crisis or a crisis of democratic capitalism? A democratic system is based on universal suffrage, 1, and consent, 2. It's the essential ideas that everybody has a vote and the system rests ultimately on the consent of the people at large to the system. If relative poverty and we can't define this because these are social norms and they vary across societies, but if relative poverty goes beyond or inequality goes beyond a certain point, consent, in my view, will be withdrawn. And then you have a crisis of the political system, which will express itself in terms of economic demands of various kinds. So my answer to your first question is also my answer to your second question. I find the question, I'm not an expert on Spain, to put it mildly. I've only done one clever thing about Spain in my professional life, which is that I forecast the crisis. And that was easy because I wasn't living in Spain. All you needed to do is look at the statistics. But there was a time when, as a result of the fact that I forecast the crisis, that I wondered whether I would get in or out of Spain safely. After that, after the crisis happened, it was easy. So that's the only thing that I knew. It had the most extraordinary housing come property bubble I ever seen in a developed world. Now, there are several hypotheses about why, even though Spain had an immense rise in immigration, and after the crisis, a colossally high unemployment on every statistic, youth, and why it appears, and this is the outsider, this did not emerge uniquely as a salient political issue. And I think I have the following hypotheses, and you can tell me later which is right. One is many of the immigrants, though not all, were Spanish-speaking people from Latin America, and they were seen as being very like the domestic population. In the same way, if it had been the case that all the immigrants from the EU, to which the British have recently complained, actually were all people with the same numbers from Australia and New Zealand, no one would have noticed. Okay, that's one hypothesis. It has to do with culture, therefore. The second hypothesis is that most of these people ended up doing jobs that even after the crisis, they disappeared altogether, so nobody had them, or people in Spain didn't want to do anyway. I don't think that's very plausible to my mind. The third possibility is that the Spanish protests against the crisis politically transmuted into other things. And the most obvious thing, at least in the case of one part of Spain, is the independence movement in Catalonia. There are people in Madrid, I do not comment, who think that that was all about the crisis. And the final possibility is that the Spanish are simply more civilized than anybody else. So I'm perfectly prepared to leave you that. Finally, on the role of central banks, I have written many, many columns defending central banks, and even wrote a book defending central banks. But I think with Eva Novotny here, it's not my job to do so, except to say it was my view before the crisis, it was my view during the crisis, and it has been my view since the crisis. And I'm not saying I'm right, it's just what I believe. It is the core thesis of my book on the crisis, that the central banks central bank monetary policy did not cause the crisis. Central banks, the banking system, interacting with huge structural shifts in the world economy did cause the crisis. But if we want to prevent such crises in future, it was a failure of regulation in a huge way, and it's a failure of the financial system in a huge way, but it's not a failure of central banking in its standard operational modalities, wasn't and isn't, given the system we've given them to operate. And given the system that we've given them to operate, I think the central banks were not responsible for the crisis in terms of monetary policy, and since then, they've done a reasonable job of getting us out of it. That's a very controversial view, I know, but it is the view I hold. And I suspect you will agree.
I'm sure you will disagree. So central banks cause or cure?
We know each other quite some time, so yes, of course I agree with this. But perhaps if I may differentiate a bit, because rightly so, you said central banks with regard to monetary policy. But of course, central banks, in many cases, have also other responsibilities. And for instance, Alan Greenspan, the governor of the of the Fed at this time, he was an enthusiastic proponent for a policy of deregulation. And this is quite obvious, that this policy of deregulation was one of the main causes for this big economic crisis, financial crisis that we had. When we did have this crisis, then I think central banks acted in the right way. On the one hand, and as Martin Wolf has said, with a very strong, kind of even aggressive monetary policy, and also that we do have, of course, a policy of re-regulation. So all what we see as the Basel agreements, what we see as the new regulation that we have at the European level, which leads to that banks have to have higher capital shares, that therefore they cannot have such high leverage as they have had before. All this is making the banking system stronger. What I'm afraid about is that we now in the US have a tendency to return to the old mistakes. It is true that, of course, some of this regulation might have been too intrusive, and so that there might be some aspects that can be discussed. But basically, it would be really a disaster if there would be, and this is to a certain extent announced by some of the proponents of the, especially also of proponents that have been sent now into the Fed, of a further round of deregulation. So I think one hopefully has to learn the history, but I have to say, and this is quite interesting, and also because to a certain extent we had the good luck that when the crisis broke out, at the head of the Federal Reserve, with Ben Bernanke, we had a professor of economics whose special field is the recession of the 1930s. And I think it was back in the mind of every central banker. We must not repeat the mistakes of the 1930s. And I would say, you definitely, you're sure you know, Schopenhauer once said, the only thing that history is teaching us is that nobody is learning from it. But this is a case where we did learn something, hopefully.
Thank you. So we're already 10 minutes over time, but we will take one more round of questions, at least two. Again, ladies first. Yeah, the lady there, please.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Isabella. I'm spatial planner, and I have two questions. The first one, how do you see the actual political happenings in Austria linked to the whole situations you explained around crisis and the turns in political systems? I'd like to get a feeling how you both see the situation right now. And my second question is referring to your comment before about the labor market and the social system and borders. I'd like to know what exactly you meant by open borders are not possible, and concerning the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you. We collect another one. Willy, now, your choice, your turn.
Wilfried Alzinger, Department of Economics. I have a special question to Martin Wolf. I've read also your articles from the Financial Times concerning this issue. There you mentioned several times the inequality in particular and the inequality of wealth. You mentioned the issue that the big
international corporations, in particular in the IT sector, have a very, very profound power. If we discuss the trust issue in more detail, and I think the greatest threat to the democratic system comes in the losing or declining trust, then we have to discuss the inequality issue in particular. And the inequality, if we discuss inequality of income, we have to say that income can be income from labor and can be income from capital. And we do have a very specific unequal distribution concerning this issue. And if we discuss the income of capital, then we have to discuss the wealth inequality, the stock of wealth inequality. And why I do mention this, I think the actual global problem is that we do have not any longer any consensus between firms, employees, and governments. Ewald Nowotny has mentioned it, and also you. We do have not an international body who can govern or regulate the global markets. And I think what we can actually see is, for example, the regulation of the financial markets or the regulation of the IT markets. It's more or less done by the companies, and it's not that much done by the politicians. So I would argue that politics is captured already by wealth, by economic wealth. And if we discuss this issue, only if we discuss this issue, I think then we come a little bit further. And finally, then we could also discuss the issue of the tax, of the Panama Papers and all that. So thank you very much, and sorry for...
Okay, would you like to start?
I'm going to be cowardly on, or at least moderately cowardly on Austrian events, and because what do I know about what's going on in Austria? To the outside eye, the dominant event here seems to be fear of immigrants. I may be wrong. And that certainly fits in with what's happened elsewhere. But I'm going to pass on the other aspects because I really haven't studied the Austrian economic, social, and political system in recent times closely enough to make an informed comment. So I'm going to leave that to the governor, if he dares to do it. Obviously, in electoral terms, the electoral success of right-wing populists is a common theme across Europe, which is why I'm less confident than Ewald Nowotny that Europe is somehow going to be saved from the curse that we've seen in the English-speaking countries, England, Britain, and America. The second question, maybe I misunderstand this. There's a fairly well-known, I mean, the point I was trying to make earlier on what I call citizenship rent is basically a pretty obvious one, which is that there are perfectly good economic reasons why we would expect a very large number of people to want to come and live in prosperous Western countries, and why it is possible to export a very large range of goods very profitably to rich countries. And both of these processes have large differential effects on our labor markets, both in practice and in terms of how people fear these changes. And so, and I regard this as structural and long-term. This is structural and long-term. It's not tomorrow. It's not just today and tomorrow. It's long-term. Maintaining moderate degrees of openness while managing the tensions associated with that is going to be, has been and is going to be very difficult. The final point I would want to make, I think what you were saying was that we're already plutocracies, right? Yeah. As I argued in my piece, in my presentation, though it had to be fairly cursory, I think to a substantial degree that is true. So that then gets to the question, which that's why I had the quote from Scheidel. Scheidel's view is, in essence, and that's why the book is so depressing and so influential, is that plutocracy is inevitable, and because of plutocracy, the realistic policy set is much smaller than the theoretical policy set. Okay? And in fact, the realistic policy set may be so small as to be non-existent. Scheidel's view also is that there are special circumstances in which that ceases to be true. Unfortunately, the special circumstances in which that ceases to be true are all catastrophic. So if you read the Scheidel view of the world, we are doomed. Okay? So I ended my piece by saying that's a really serious set of challenges, which you have to think about very hard. And as economists, you cannot assume that the can opener we would like to have to change policy is a can opener that actually exists. So then the question which I'm trying to address in the book I'm trying to write is there any way out of that trap? Since, one, I don't want catastrophe, particularly as catastrophe now, we cannot repeat. As I tried to point out in one of those charts, which comes out from the work of many people, including Piketty, but also Scheidel, the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century were massively redistributionist, which doesn't make, as I point out in my column for tomorrow, catastrophe is not a sane policy. So that's clearly not, that we can't do. So the really interesting question is whether we can find ways of being imaginative in terms of policy, which in my view requires quite a lot of international cooperation, given the political resistance to that. And my view on that, my answer to that is, you have to try. Am I confident we will succeed? Not at all. And if so, we're going to go to hell. And that's a very bad way to leave the world to these fine young people. So we have to try.
Thank you. You would like to add something?
If I may contrast this view of Scheidel with the views of famous Austrian economist and his book, Josef Schumpeter,
of course,
and his book Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, which, by the way, when I studied
also very pessimistic.
Yeah, but
and he was wrong.
Well, no, I don't think so. First, I want to use this as a kind of pedagogical advice, because at least at the time when I was in the US, this was a required reading at universities. I'm not sure if it is even known here at the university, but the basic point is that Schumpeter, like Marx, says capitalism has huge dynamics, but it is such a cruel system that at the end of the day, even the next generation of plutocrats will not follow this way. And so it is so that at the end of the politically such a system cannot survive, or not will be modified. So it's not really the opposite of this, but it's working with modifications. And to a certain extent, if you look at economic history and political history, there always has been some new revolts, and so some of them might have been populistic, but some of them might have been in a more, let's say, socially oriented side. So I would not. I would not be that pessimistic. So this is one aspect. The other one that you have been asked about, I've been asked about this open border and social welfare systems, as Martin Wolf has said, I think it's not about that there may be no immigration. I think every modern economy needs immigration for many reasons. But it's about controlled immigration. And control in the way, how can you adapt this with the existing situation in this country? So what you have called this citizenship rent. And because if you do not have some kind of controlled immigration, but uncontrolled immigration, then you might get in a very strong disequilibrium between the social benefits on the one side and the financing of these benefits on the other side. And if there is this disequilibrium, the system will break down. And first, obviously, it will not get political support any longer. So therefore, I think you always have to look at this, what is possible, to what is this equilibrium. In that amount, you can have immigration. If this is going above, then you will get a reaction which is extremely negative.
Thank you. It's 25 minutes over time. I'm sure we could continue this discussion for at least 1 hour or longer. So, but we can also do this informally over some food and over some drinks, for which the department and VU invites you now outside. I would like to use this opportunity to thank you once more, Mr. Wolf, and you, Mr. Nowotny, for your excellent contributions. A lot of stuff to think about. Please join us for some drinks. Have a nice evening.